Who would have believed that despite technological advancements, space travel would become more risky and frightening? Questions about how to get the 3 stranded crew members from the International Space Station ISS home after their Soyuz crew capsule sprung a leak while docked at the orbiting outpost have been keeping scientists awake at night. Since then, Roscosmos and Nasa officials have been looking into how the coolant line of the capsule's external radiator could have been punctured while 2 cosmonauts were preparing for a spacewalk. The vehicle, known as MS22, began spraying its cooling liquid into space on December 14th, and looking closely at the dramatic NASA TV images, you would see snowflake-like particles spraying from the rear section of the capsule. According to Sergei Krikalev, the head of Russia's Roscosmos human spaceflight programs, the damage remains under assessment and control. Nonetheless, several explanations and theories of what might have caused the leak are being evaluated. Plausible causes. At first, a strike by a Geminid meteor was said to have caused the hole in the leaky Russian Soyuz spacecraft. But after critical evaluation, this was ruled out. Scientists did observe the meteor showers that were occurring. Both the trajectory team in Houston and the trajectory team in Moscow confirmed the hole was not from the meteor showers, that the spacecraft was positioned in the wrong direction. However, the observation team concluded that a strike by another tiny space object could be responsible for this. Recently, NASA used cameras on the station's Canadarm2 robotic arm to inspect the suspected leak area. They discovered a small hole in the MS22, which appears to be the source of the leak. However, its origin remains a mystery to everyone. Considering the size of the hole, 0.8 millimeters wide, about 0.03 inches, any object capable of creating such a tiny hole would be too difficult to track down from Earth. Another possibility was whether it could be due to a hardware issue. And to detect that, it's going to be a lot of hard work. You might be wondering why NASA is so involved in this. When you consider the name Roscosmos, it's obvious it's a Russian spacecraft. NASA has been helping Russia's federal space agency Roscosmos with the leak investigation. And not just because both agencies are major ISS partners. Don't forget that one of the 3 men stranded in space is an American astronaut. This Soyuz brought NASA astronaut Frank Rubio and 2 cosmonauts to the orbiting lab in September, and is scheduled to return the trio to Earth in March. Part of the investigation process is an assessment of the MS-22's flightworthiness. Since the spacecraft is losing its coolant, it will undoubtedly become hot sooner or later, which raises the question of whether it can safely transport the 3 space travelers home. The fate of these 3 young men is in the hands of the Russian space crew and engineers, who must complete thermal analyses to determine how hot it will get inside the Soyuz on its return to Earth, and whether it can safely transport the 3 space flyers home. But why would the spacecraft's worthiness be questioned? Let's dive a little deeper into its records. Soyuz is a series of spacecraft designed for the Soviet space program. It was used for the first time in 1961. All Soyuz spacecraft are launched on a Soyuz rocket from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. This rocket happens to be one of the most powerful and reliable launch vehicles in history. The Soviet Union's ambition to maintain its position in the space industry ultimately drove the innovation of the Soyuz rocket. The first Soyuz rocket launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome on November 28, 1966, and it has outlived all other spacefaring rockets of its time. The rocket was developed in the early 1960s by the space engineering firm OKB-1, which at the time was headed by Sergei Korolev. Not too long after, the Soyuz rocket was completed and put to the test. But their first docking attempt would end in tragedy. Colonel Vladimir Komarov launched on the Soyuz's first manned mission on the 23rd of April 1967, and was to dock with a second spacecraft. But complications caused the mission to be aborted. Komarov attempted re-entry, but his spacecraft's parachute failed to deploy correctly, and he was killed as his capsule plummeted to Earth. The next attempt occurred on the 25th of October, 1968. Georgy Beregovoy managed to get within 200 meters of his target, but was unable to dock. This feat was finally accomplished on the 16th of January 1969, when Soyuz cosmonauts accomplished the first docking between 2 crewed spacecraft, with Yevgeny Krunov and Alexei Yeleseyev transferring from their spacecraft into another commanded by Vladimir Shatilov. Fun fact, astronauts of the Soviet or Russian space program are called cosmonauts. As the Soviet Union's ambitions expanded, so did the power of the Soyuz. A Soyuz L rocket launched the Soviet lunar lander into low Earth orbit on November 24, 1970, in preparation for a mission to the Moon. Although the Soyuz L only launched 3 times between November 1970 and August 1971, its design impacted the Soyuz U rocket, which still serves the International Space Station today. The Soviet space program continued to grow, with the Soyuz rocket as its centerpiece. But tragedy was not far away either. On the 22nd of April, 1971, a Soyuz rocket transported 3 cosmonauts up to Salyut 1, the first space station of any kind. But they couldn't enter due to a fault in the docking unit, and the mission was also aborted. The docking was successful on June 7, 1971, during the follow-up Soyuz 11 mission. But an error occurred during the return trip to Earth, leading to a sudden loss of atmosphere in the descent module, thus killing all 3 men aboard. The 3 cosmonauts were shielded from the cold in space, but not from depressurization. Due to that unfortunate incident, all future missions would require cosmonauts to wear spacesuits while in space. July 1973 recorded the first docking of spacecraft from different countries. The metaphorical and literal shaking of hands between the 2 superpowers was a milestone for spaceflight. The docking module was a combined US-Soviet effort, and each crew had learned the other's language. On the 2nd of December 1974, the Soyuz U rocket made its first crewed flight as a trial run for the Apollo-Soyuz mission. Despite the fact that the Soviet agency kept upgrading their vehicles and rockets, there were still occasional malfunctions. Another tragedy struck on the 26th of September 1983, as 2 cosmonauts sat in the capsule atop a Soyuz U rocket, preparing for a mission to service the Salyut 7 space station. Spilled fuel caused the spacecraft to burst into flames, destroying the control wires, including its automatic ejector escape system. The mission control team manually activated the escape mechanism, launching the spacecraft and its passengers 4 kilometers away from the raging flame just seconds before it exploded, saving the lives of the 2 cosmonauts. Yet, the Soviets remained unshaken and continued to send the Soyuz U rocket into space. Another major milestone in spaceflight history occurred in July 2011, when the American space shuttle fleet was retired. Ever since then, the 5 space agencies behind the ISS, NASA, Roscosmos, JAXA, ESA, and CSA, now use Soyuz rockets to fly crews into orbit. The Soyuz TMA, ever since, became the major means of transporting crew members to and from the orbiting laboratory, and is always docked at the space station as a lifeboat in the event of an emergency. A Soyuz TMA spacecraft can launch and return to Earth from the station with up to 3 crew members. Also, a flight back to Earth on the Soyuz craft takes less than 3.5 hours. Eventualities. If eventually, it's concluded that bringing the trio on MS-22 back home is too risky, the Roscosmos agency might as well plan to fast-track the launch of the next Soyuz spacecraft. Despite the fact that the spacecraft is planned to launch with 3 crew in March from Russia's Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. Fast-tracking would entail launching it uncrewed a few weeks early, maybe in late February, according to Joe Montalbano, ISS program manager. In that scenario, the MS-22 would still come back to Earth, but empty. And if it eventually lands safely, that would be so interesting, as scientists would be able to collect data for future evaluations. Unfortunately, this is not the first leak on the Soyuz spacecraft. In 2018, the Soyuz capsule experienced an air leak, which Roscosmos said might have been sabotaged. Astronauts used tape to seal the leak. Though it caused a small loss of pressure, it was not life-threatening. Though MS-22 flew Russian cosmonauts Dmitry Petelin and Sergei Prokopyev, as well as NASA astronaut Frank Rubio, to the ISS since September, the Russian space agency emphasizes that the crew are safe and not in danger. What if the launch of the new spacecraft cannot be accelerated? NASA came up with an idea that probably SpaceX could be of help. NASA stated last week that it reached out to SpaceX about the idea of returning with extra crew members in Dragon if the need arises in an emergency. SpaceX has yet to provide an immediate response. SpaceX does have a track record of successful missions, so it's logical that it could send spacecraft equipped to bring home the stranded trio. However, it's not as simple as just sending a spacecraft up, because SpaceX always creates custom suits for its flyers. Besides, any impromptu rescue mission might also have a major impact on other scheduled ISS missions, like the upcoming SpaceX Crew 6 mission set for an early 2023 takeoff. There are currently 7 people aboard the Orbital Outpost, ISS. SpaceX Crew 5 launched October 5, 2022, with 4 astronauts on board, and ISS Soyuz MS22 3-man crew. So, should MS22 be deemed unfit, it would also mean the ISS has just 1 lifeboat, capable of carrying only 3 people, in case they all need to be evacuated. Let's hope they make the right decision.